welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director of the Orchestre National de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive into this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Deborah, Sheldon, Allison, Chris, Olivia, Jay, and Neil, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/stickynotespodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. So I am busy preparing for 2 weeks of concerts coming up. The first is with the CBSO, the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, a program with Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances, William Grant Still's Poem for Orchestra, and the Dvorak Cello Concerto with a cellist that I know pretty well named Elisa Weilerstein, my sister. And the next week will be in Lille with the Orchestre National de Lille, and we will be doing Shostakovich's 13th Symphony, the Babi Yar Symphony, and Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw. Last week, I actually put up a bonus episode for those of you who speak French. My first ever Sticky Notes podcast episode in French, all about the Babi Yar Symphony, but there is also an English version of that episode way back in the archives, so I do encourage you to check that out if you are interested. Really hope you enjoy this week's episode on a piece that you might not be that familiar with, Amy Beach's Gaelic Symphony. Hope you enjoy it. Amy Beach is a name that might not be familiar to you. She was born in 1867 and died in 1944, and her life was one of the most fascinating and varied in musical history. She was a child prodigy, became a successful pianist, and then pivoted to composing at her husband's request. She was one of the first successful composers without any training from Europeans, something we'll get into later on. And when her Gaelic Symphony was performed for the first time in 1896, it became the first symphony by an American woman to be published or performed. This symphony and Beach's whole career is inextricably linked with the history and the mores of the time, from the influence of Dvorak on American music to Beach's stop-and-start relationship to performing. The Gaelic Symphony is a remarkable amalgamation of American symphonic brilliance, some European influence, especially from Dvorak, and the music of Beach's own heritage. It's a symphony that was very popular in its time, but then was quickly forgotten, but now is finding itself on the stage more and more often. This week on the show, we'll go through this beautiful symphony, a pillar of early American classical music, and a piece that certainly deserves to be better known than it is. All this and more is coming right up on Sticky Notes. Amy Beach, born Amy Marcy Cheney, was by all accounts a true child prodigy. She was able to sing dozens of songs by the age of 1 and was composing her own works by the age of 4. She did all of this without much, if any, access to a piano, since she was forbidden to play in her very early years by her Calvinist mother, who thought that Amy playing the piano would damage parental authority. But Amy persisted, and finally she was allowed to play by the age of 6, studying with her mother. She began playing in public almost immediately, and though she was offered concert tours by agents looking to cash in on her child prodigy potential, her parents declined. At the age of 14, Amy began to study counterpoint and harmony, and this would turn out to be her only formal instruction in composition. She debuted as a pianist with the then almost brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra at the age of 17 to huge acclaim, and it certainly seemed as if Amy was headed to an illustrious career as a soloist and recitalist. But the following year, Amy got married to Dr. Henry Harris Aubrey Beach, a brilliant surgeon who was 24 years older than Amy. Beach had a few conditions for their marriage, one of which was that Amy essentially stop performing and devote herself entirely to composition. She would give 2 performances a year, both recitals that raised money for charity, and would spend her life as a composer. In 2025, this obviously seems quite outdated, to say the least, but for the time, Henry Beach was actually extremely supportive of his wife, if in the limited way that he approved of. He would apparently come home every day from work and ask Amy what she had composed that day, and he was vigorously supportive of her compositions being performed by other people. This confidence led Amy, now known in public as Mrs. H.H.A. Beach, to compose several large-scale works early on in their marriage, including a 70-minute mass and a 40-minute-long symphony, the one we're going to be talking about today. After the death of her husband in 1910, Beach began performing again, touring to Europe for the very first time. As the writer Joseph Horowitz says, quote, "During her long widowhood, Beach was one of the most admired women in America, a model of female accomplishment." Let's come back to the Gaelic Symphony now, but to do that, we have to start with Dvorak. I've told this story a few times on this show, but the short version of it is that Dvorak arrived in the United States in 1892 to be the new director of the National Conservatory in New York. Soon after his arrival, he discovered folk music from America, namely from Black American and a bit later on, Native American sources. Dvorak was inspired, to put it mildly, by this music, and he would compose a few pretty famous pieces that were directly influenced by Black American and Native American folk music, including his New World Symphony, his American String Quartet, and his lesser-known tone poem, America. When the New World Symphony was premiered, Dvorak gave some now famous advice to American composers. He said, quote, "I am convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on what are called Negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them. In the Negro melodies of America, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music." This was an extremely controversial statement at the time, and to understand that, we have to go back a bit further in time to near the beginnings of American classical music, which was all concentrated in New England. What I want to specifically talk about today is the second New England school, which included composers like George Whitefield Chadwick, Edward MacDowell, Horatio Parker, as well as Amy Beach, though she was a kind of second-generation member of the second New England school. Many of these composers went to Europe to study and came back to essentially copy the style of those European composers like Liszt, Wagner, and Brahms. American classical composers of the time essentially ignored their homegrown folk music, preferring to take their influences from Europe. Dvorak's message in 1893 sent shockwaves through the American musical establishment. Somehow, an outsider needed to deliver the message that the folk music of America was an incredible source, just like European folk music had been an incredible source for composers like Dvorak, but also Brahms, Liszt, and many, many others. But Dvorak's message was not heeded initially. Many composers rejected it outright, with Edward MacDowell in particular saying, quote, "We have here in America been offered a pattern for an American national music costume by the Bohemian Dvorak, though what Negro melodies have to do with an Americanism in art still remains a mystery." Black musicians, on the other hand, were thrilled. The Freeman, a black newspaper of the time, called Dvorak, quote, "our greatest friend from across the sea." Amy Beach was somewhat in the middle of this debate. She was quite impressed with Dvorak's pronouncements, but she wasn't as impressed by his admonition that American composers should go to Black or Native American sources. Beach didn't understand why she should be expected to embrace music that was not of her own heritage. But that didn't mean she ignored Dvorak entirely, and actually later on in her career she was influenced by Native American music particularly. Instead of looking at native sources at this moment in her life, though, she decided to look at her own heritage, saying, quote, "We of the North should be far more likely to be influenced by Old English, Scotch, or Irish songs, inherited with our literature from our ancestors." Beach decided to write a large-scale symphony somewhat in the spirit of the New World Symphony, but she did so by drawing on that Old English, Scottish, and Irish heritage, and that's where we'll start with the Gaelic Symphony. Beach took a Celtic theme from her song Dark is the Night for the beginning of the symphony, and it pervades practically the entire first movement. The movement is a large-scale, traditional Romantic-era symphonic first movement. It is in sonata form, meaning an exposition where the main themes are laid out, then a development where those themes are twisted around and turned over, a recapitulation where those themes come back, and a coda where everything is summed up. In Beach's case, she slightly modifies this traditional form by adding a third theme in the exposition, but we'll get to that a little bit later. First, let's hear the song Dark is the Night, since it provides so much of the material for the movement. This recording of Dark is the Night is sung by Lauren Flanagan with Christopher O'Reilly at the piano. So how does a composer take a 90-second long song and turn that theme into a 10-minute long symphonic movement? Well, first Beach expands that agitated music from the beginning of the song to create a brilliantly exciting introduction. From the depths of the orchestra, a chromatic line rises and rises, creating more and more drama. At the top of this musical mountain, the theme appears for the first time in the trumpets, followed by the horns. In case you couldn't hear the text of the song in that recording I played for you, here it is, followed by how this music appears in the Gaelic Symphony. The sea is full of wandering foam, the sky of driving cloud. My restless thoughts among them roam, the night is dark and loud. Now that the theme has been established, Beach brings things back down again, only to start the tremendous momentum again. Undoubtedly, Beach wanted to create a dramatic scene on the sea here, in some ways an homage to Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture. You might, if you have perfect pitch, also have noticed that the key of this music is E minor, exactly the same as Dvorak's at the time brand new New World Symphony. I don't know if the key choices in this movement are explicitly an homage to Dvorak, but many composers' first symphonies feature elements of the composers who inspired them, from Beethoven with Mozart and Haydn to Brahms with Beethoven, etc. With that powerful arrival into E minor, Beach begins her transition to the second theme in the movement. But it is not a simple transition that just arrives at the second theme. Instead, fragments of themes poke through the texture while Beach rapidly changes keys. We hear fragments of the Dark as the Night theme as we seem to be trying to find our way to firmer harmonic ground. And then a surprise. Instead of wholly new music, Beach uses the same agitated accompaniment from the beginning to introduce the second theme, which comes from this moment in The Dark is the Night song, on the text, "Where are the hours that came to me, so beautiful and bright?" Beach gives this theme to the clarinet, but then immediately begins developing it, just as she did with the first theme. It's remarkable to me to see and hear how much material Beach mines from this short song. Just like in the New World Symphony, Beach's second theme is quite short, because she needs to make room, just as Dvorak did, for a third theme in the relative major key of E minor, which is G major. Dvorak famously was inspired for his third theme by the spiritual Swing Low Sweet Chariot. Beach also goes for a folksy source for her third theme, but her choice is an Irish jig, which adds a dancing element to what has been a serious and dramatic exposition. The exposition unwinds peacefully and calmly, having taken us through 3 distinct themes. We're now entering the stormy development section, though at first Beach seems to fool us into thinking that we are repeating the entire exposition. But quickly, the Dark as the Night theme goes into a new direction, with the drama increasing every step of the way. Beach uses some very traditional developmental techniques here, but this doesn't make them any less exciting. She previews something she will do later, which is to expand the rhythm of the Dark as the Night theme into 3 quarter notes, which act against the 2 feeling in this music. Then she halves the values so that the Dark as the Night theme seems to be moving faster than ever before. This is textbook composition, again, not surprising for someone writing their first symphony. What is surprising is how seamlessly effective it is, and how integrated the techniques are into the music itself. Suddenly, the second theme emerges, and we understand again how closely related these 2 themes are, which makes sense, of course, considering they are part of the same short song. Beach starts to amalgamate the 2 themes until we hear fragments of them simultaneously. Like many great developments, we can see the peak coming, but we're not sure how we're going to get there. At the climactic moment of the development, Beach returns to the idea that she only hinted at earlier on, the 3 against 2 quarter notes, which now begin to dominate the texture. This is music of high drama, and the expansion out of the rhythm into those quarter notes is incredibly exciting. We're back on the stormy seas again. This intensity cannot be sustained, though, and with a sudden collapse, Beach brings everything back down. The low winds and low strings sigh with exhaustion, and the music comes to a complete stop for the first time in the whole symphony. A single clarinet plays a short solo passage until it alone seems to discover the recapitulation as if it just stumbled upon it at the bottom of the shipwreck that is the remains of the development. The recapitulation is similar to the exposition in many ways structurally, but Beach constantly adjusts her orchestration choices, which gives the recapitulation vitality and interest as she goes through the 3 themes again. But let's skip to the coda, my favorite part of this movement. Beach ends her 3rd theme, that Irish jig, back in C major, pretty surprising key in an E minor symphony. But she quickly moves away from it as the Dark as the Night theme refuses to be pushed away by anything. A new storm is brewing. Beach kicks the tempo into a new gear as she once again begins combining her first two exposition themes. But the controlled chaos of the development is now threatening to spill over, with a tremendous drive pushing us forward. The roiling music of the introduction to each section of the movement now appears loudly for the first time in the whole movement. Even this chromatic line has been infected with the drama and fever pitch of the character. In some ways, this music reminds me of Tchaikovsky's Francesca da Rimini. Chromatic music, tons of double notes in the strings, and a sense of terror that is unavoidable. In one of her most creative touches, Beach, just for a few measures, switches the rhythm from the swinging 6/8 that has dominated the movement to a more gruff and rough cut time, adding even more momentum and drive as we rush off to the end of this powerful movement. The second movement is an intermezzo and a scherzo movement wrapped up into one. This shows again the time in which Beach was writing. Even if she never had any European instruction, of course the European classical tradition held a powerful sway over all American composers. And Beach here is showing the influence of Brahms in mixing slower, more introspective music into the traditional place of the scherzo movement. The progression of the so-called dance movement in a symphony, from the graceful minuets of Mozart and Haydn, to the charged energy of Beethoven's scherzos, to Brahms' more modest intermezzi, is all here in Beach's second movement. It is marked to be played like a Siciliana, a Baroque-era title that suggests a slow but still flowing, almost dance-like theme, usually in 12/8 time, a call back to the first movement. The French horn begins this Siciliana, but the strings quickly respond, fanning out the initial horn theme and completely changing the character from the charged music of the first movement. This is all just an introduction, though, to the main theme, which is played by the oboe. This is another Gaelic-inspired theme with a gently flowing accompaniment in the lower winds. This is music that seems very carefree, but all the way along this opening section, Beach includes little harmonies that suggest that this is not quite as peaceful as it seems. The theme in the opening is in a warm F major, and that is where it sits comfortably for its first phrase. But as the first section winds to a close, Beach starts including some harmonies that suggest the chromatic intensity of the first movement. This is how a really good composer plays with folk music to add even more color and interest. That quote blue note in the bassoons creates all the tension we need and adds a kind of smoky quality to this gentle Siciliana. And as the opening section comes to an end, the accompaniment features more chromatic music, again a memory of the first movement. Suddenly, a new, much faster section appears, and we get the first lighter and more carefree music since the Irish jig third theme in the first movement. The strings play pizzicato, plucked strings, and the entire character of the music lifts off the ground. This cheerful music is actually a variation of the Siciliana melody, but played much faster and with a much more cheeky character. It's a brilliant reimagining of the Siciliana melody, and it carries us through this middle section. There's certainly more than a hint of Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony in this. Beach makes the connection between the Siciliana melody and this scherzo music more explicit by including a fragment of the Siciliana in its original 6/8 rhythm over the top of the 2/4 music, yet another rhythmic game that calls back to the first movement. It also allows her to let the music sing a bit more over the top of the chattering 16th notes, making this music even more charming. The movement takes a surprising turn, though, as Beach moves us into C-sharp minor for music that is much more dramatic and intense. It's as if the clouds have suddenly come over this pastoral scene. But it was all just a passing shower, as the triangle heralds that everything is well again, and the music continues on its cheery way. But another sudden outburst stops the music in its tracks. Solo woodwinds haltingly enter, trying to find their way back home, until the English horn, perhaps an homage to Dvorak's New World Symphony, brings us there with a return to the Siciliana melody. But the accompaniment is not with the low winds anymore. Instead, Beach creates a magical color with shimmering violins and gentle pulsations in the lower strings. This is one of the most beautiful moments of the whole symphony. Beach builds this music to a surprisingly emotional place, leaving off with two clarinets playing in thirds, marked to be played as loudly as possible and very expressively, leading back to the English horn, who unwinds to what seems like it should be the end of the movement. A, B, A. Siciliana, scherzo, Siciliana. Makes sense, right? Well, Beach is not above a little humor, as her short and snappy coda proves. The movement disappears in a puff of smoke and a cheeky flute trill. This leads us to the third movement, the true slow movement of the piece. She wrote that the movement was about, quote, the laments, romance, and dreams of the Irish people. The movement begins by taking us back to the more shrouded world of the first movement, and the overwhelming feeling we have is that we are searching for something. Finally, we find it, for the moment, in a violin solo. There are very few moments in this symphony for purely solo instruments, and one of the main criticisms of the piece, something we'll get to in the last movement, is that it is overly thick in its instrumentation. So when there's a moment for a single musician to play, it's all the more striking. This leads us to the main theme of the movement, led again by a solo instrument, this time the cello. It's hard to overstate how unusual this color is in the symphony so far, which has been dominated by those thick textures. The cello and violin play the main theme in a touching dialogue, full of wistful and nostalgic character. The winds join in, and all together we reach an emotional peak. It's not easy to write music that seems to evoke laments, romance, and dreams all in one, but Beach succeeds here. What this music has in spades is sweep, and we seem to be looking out over the Gaelic landscape with every peak and valley. The second section of the movement is completely different. Beach speeds up the tempo and the music takes on a majestic character and an almost Brucknerian sound, with thick orchestration and brass moving in block chords that takes us from key to key. Suddenly, the music of the introduction returns, but in the tempo and general character of the second theme, and slowly we return back home to the opening theme. But this time, the theme is obscured by a counter melody in the violins that seems to be more in the character of the second theme. Beach is blurring the lines here, intentionally trying to confuse us of the structure of the music. But that theme is there, rumbling around in the depths of the orchestra. After another appearance of the theme, we return back to our violin solo, which plays another cadenza-like passage, leading us to a gorgeous transfiguration of the lamenting melody into E major. Suddenly the sun has come out, though very gently, as if partially obscured by a haze. The winds take over the theme with a wonderful innocence as it acquires more and more life, and the strings, followed by the horns, infuse it with more and more spirit. The tempo starts to move and the momentum starts to build, but every time we seem to be heading to the top of the mountain, Beach falls back. At least at first, because finally, with a massive crescendo, the orchestra reaches what we believe will be a glorious and ecstatic climax. But that didn't exactly reach where we thought it would, did it? Unlike, say, Bruckner's Seventh Symphony, which thunders into its climactic moment in the slow movement, Beach turns away from the precipice, and instead of ecstasy, we return back to darkness, with the bass clarinet now taking on the theme, followed by the violins. All the joy of the previous section has been extinguished. The movement slowly unwinds, never again reaching the peak it turned away from. And in a beautiful parallel to the opening in the movement, the bass clarinet, cello, and finally the solo violin take us to the end of the movement in a desolate E minor. One is reminded of the poetry of Ossian, the end of the first movement of Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony. The loneliness and sadness is powerful, touching, and seemingly final. The last movement is also a portrayal of the Celtic people's, quote, sturdy daily life, their passions and battles. Naturally, we would expect the drama of the first movement of the symphony to return, and it does in spades, right from the start. In fact, this is a direct callback to the very end of the first movement. Here's the beginning of the fourth movement again. Beach will use that motive, ba-ba-ba-da-dum, to build the entire 9-minute long last movement. With that quick shift in key to C major, Beach introduces us to a bouncy and extremely difficult to play rhythm, and to the clarinets, who turn the dramatic opening into a folk music-inspired romp, which proceeds to pass itself around the orchestra while rapidly changing keys. This movement is where the criticisms of the symphony really start in terms of its orchestration. Beach chooses to use a very thick and romantic-era orchestra, and she often doubles instruments, like the trombones doubling the cellos and basses, for example. This kind of block writing can create a kind of clunky sound that's kind of difficult for orchestras to avoid. But the recording you've been listening to today with the Detroit Symphony and Némi Järvi masterfully avoids this, showing that, like with Schumann, for example, orchestration deficiencies can be overcome by a good conductor and orchestra knowing where to, quote, help out the composer. In this case, this climactic moment of the first theme of this sonata form movement sounds powerful and direct, rather than clunky and elephantine. Finally, though, Beach slows things down for a gorgeous and lush second theme, also based on Irish melodies. The cellos and violas begin the theme, but soon the violins take over with a huge dramatic sweep. This is certainly the passions of the Celtic people being portrayed here. In that moment you just heard, Beach simply cuts this theme off before it can naturally finish, and leaves us with silence. Why? Well, Beach is about to interrupt the passions with what I can only assume is the battles, as suddenly the trombones take over the second theme, marked to be played with vigor, while slashing chords in the rest of the orchestra suggest that things have taken a dark and violent turn. This is actually the development of the movement. Beach basically skips the traditional coda of the exposition in order to jump right to the development, which works fantastically for dramatic purposes. Listen to the next passages and try to pick out the two themes as they flit in and out of the dramatic texture. The second theme, the falling cello and viola theme, is a constant presence in this development, and it becomes increasingly passionate and even agitated. Listen to this moment where the violins play the theme over a syncopated accompaniment in the horns. This music is pulsing with energy and a barely suppressed fear. At the climactic moment of the development, Beach puts her two themes together. The violins playing the passionate second theme, while the winds and brass play the martial first theme. As this dies down, that difficult bouncy rhythm in the strings makes a hesitating return. Are we ready to move back into the recapitulation? Slowly but surely we realize that yes, we are ready, as the first theme returns as chipper as before, though perhaps a bit bruised from the battles of the development. Like in the first movement, the recapitulation is quite similar to the exposition, though with tons of subtle orchestration changes. Let's skip to the coda of the movement and of this symphony now. Remember that the exposition had no closing section, but in the recap, Beach allows the second theme to fully unwind until we arrive back into E minor. To begin the coda, Beach inverts her second theme. Before, it started with a downward plunge, but now it strives upwards. Slowly things begin to build to an absolute fever pitch. Clearly, Beach was a master at writing exciting codas. And as we get towards the peak, Beach brings back the first theme in the brass, riding over the top of driving eighth notes. Now Beach places her second theme fragment over the bouncy accompaniment of the first theme. These two themes are deeply related, but Beach keeps expanding these relationships, making them ever clearer as we approach the end of the symphony. And with one final struggle, Beach changes keys and we arrive into a glorious E major. The two themes work together in expanded form as the piece turns inexorably towards triumph and ecstasy. This breakthrough allows the symphony to fully shed the tension of any of the previous movements, and we rush off to the end in full glory. It's a thrilling end to a thrilling symphony, and it never fails to rouse the spirits of anyone who listens to it. Remember that second New England school I mentioned way back at the beginning of the show? Well, they were heartily impressed by Beach's symphony. George Whitefield Chadwick wrote Amy Beach a letter after hearing the premiere of the symphony, saying, quote, "I always feel a thrill of pride myself whenever I hear a fine work by any of us, and as such you will have to be counted in, whether you will or not, one of the boys." Later, Beach was officially recognized as a member of the Second New England School. The symphony was regularly performed during Beach's lifetime, but soon, like most of the Second New England School's music, it became thought of as outdated and anachronistic during the musical upheavals of the 1920s. Music was going in another direction, and a big-boned romantic symphony wasn't really in the style. The piece was essentially forgotten for decades, and it is only now making its way back to the stage thanks to a renewed focus on bringing the works of female composers to the concert hall. Still, it is quite rarely performed because 40-minute symphonies by unknown composers rarely sell a lot of tickets, and many orchestras are barely hanging on at the moment and can't really afford a box office failure. So, if this show today can contribute to anything in the classical music world, it would be to say that if you like what you heard in this symphony, or if there are any unknown works that you particularly enjoy, tell your local orchestra that you will buy a ticket to hear that piece performed. It was a joy to go through this wonderful but relatively unknown symphony with you today, and I want to thank James Manishin, whose article was a valuable source for the show today, and to Joseph Horowitz, whose article on Amy Beach was also an extremely helpful source. And thank you for listening to Sticky Notes today. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And please send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.